right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to week 13. We're making some great progress. I just want to give you a heads up and talk briefly about an overview with the rest of this course. This is the second to last lecture with new content. Next week, we're going to cover foreign policy from the U.S. perspective. And this week, we're going to give you a little roadmap on how to make change as an individual within our government. Some of this lecture will be review, looking at how political party landscapes change, reminding you of some key terms, looking at some specific constitutional amendments that we have not looked at yet, looking at how they were implemented, why they were implemented, and really to convey to you the power that you have as a citizen to even do something as radical as implement a constitutional amendment. So this is one of the lectures that I enjoy a little bit more than most, where I get to tell you how we can actually make some change. We can look at some examples of how people, individuals, had the power to impact society, and that's what makes us get into American government. That's what gets us into politics. The power to change the world just by advocating for yourself and those you love and those around you in your community. So, Guide to Making Change in the U.S. Next week we have foreign policy, and then after that I'm going to give you a review lecture, and then we're just going to wrap up the course. Give you a little bit of extra time to work on your final exam, to get your final essay wrapped up. Give you some time to reach out to me to make sure you have all the help you need to pass this class, to succeed on this essay, which is very important, and to make sure you understand how to study for the final, which, let me give you a hint, the best way to study for the final is to review your quizzes. I have made sure that all of them, except for the most recent one, are re-released with the correct answers, so make sure you go over that. If it's a written response answer and it was incorrect, some of you have made comments, but also just look at your What Did We Learn slides to make sure you have the right answer for that question. Now, after you study all your quizzes, the best way to wrap it up is to study the What Did We Learn slides from this lecture and next week's lecture, because they will also be on the quiz. But I'll do you the favor of only asking you either very, very simple and very minimal written response questions, but the vast majority of new content on your final will be multiple choice. So, a guide to making change in the U.S. Let's get going. So, learning objectives, look at the political landscape, how it changes, cover some key terms we've already talked about, review, identify 2 avenues to implementing constitutional change, 2 avenues to implementing a constitutional amendment, as there is not just one clear pathway. We're going to have a brief discussion about social movements, although I have cut a little bit of this out of this semester's lecture. We're also going to understand the indirect ways to implement change in the U.S. through other avenues beyond constitutional amendments, and learn how to make change at large. Learn how to become a better citizen. So let's go. Let's cover some key terms in the past. We remember how political landscapes change when you look at political parties. We know that what leads people to vote is candidate characteristics, issues involved, and party loyalties. So one thing that can reveal this changing landscapes is that dimension of candidate characteristics. We've seen some third-party candidates in our past. Remember the key ones: Theodore Roosevelt, George Wallace, and Ross Perot, which each represented a new position on government that was to be adapted to some degree later on, which revealed upcoming shifts in the political landscape on a significant level. We also see that when we look at these candidates, sometimes you'll see unique candidates that, like that other reason, that unique candidate characteristics. Sometimes these unique candidates by themselves can represent significant shifts in the political landscape, and represent a large percent of the primary vote that had a previously unrecognized sentiment. Think about Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Trump with the drain the swamp sentiments, Bernie Sanders with the 99% sentiment. We see that they really revealed sentiments and segments of the population that feel underrepresented and reveal the interests and policy positions that they would advocate for, and brings future change to the political landscape. And then we remember these 3 key terms that will be on the final: party realignment, substantial amount of voters, not just you, not just Joe, it's all of y'all, changing from one party to another. Now, party de-alignment makes sense, just make it a D. When a substantial number of voters leaves both political parties and lose their identification through either of the 2 primary parties. Now, we also look at a key term, tipping, which I always represent through a documentary that none of y'all have seen at this point on Netflix, Wild Wild Country or Wild Wild West, something like that. A bunch of people dressed in orange. but they moved to a small town and their population grew and grew and grew to the point where they started overwhelming the local government and gaining representation because their population grew so much that they changed the balance, the political balance in their district. And if they kept growing, they could change the political balance in their state. And when you look at demographic shifts, if you see certain demographics growing at large, they can even create significant shifts within your country, revealing a impact from tipping. So very important key terms to remember. All of this is review. Remember the third-party candidates, what they did as they revealed sentiments. Theodore Roosevelt, new approach to federal government. George Wallace, the pro-segregationist sentiment. Ross Perot, the anti-two-party establishment sentiment, all revealed by these three third-party candidates runs for president. So we want to remember how the political landscape changes, because that's an important part to understand how your change, what you may advocate for, is actually playing out. Because we know the first avenue for protest within the United States is to vote. That is your first avenue of civil disobedience, not civil disobedience, of protest and revealing the sentiments that you believe are important in government. Civil disobedience, remember, are actions that where you purposefully and peacefully break laws that you believe inadequate to reveal the detriment of those laws. Think of Plessy during Plessy versus not Plessy. Think of Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson. So indirect avenues for change in the US. This is just a conversational slide. You will not have to remember any specific points from this slide, but remember legislative actions by Congress. Your Congress, the individuals we elect to represent both our House of Representatives and the Senate, can draft legislation and implement constitutional amendments that significantly change the role our government plays in our individual lives. We also know that the president can enact specific executive orders, although we remember from our executive branch lecture that a lot of these executive orders can be overturned as the power of the purse is granted to Congress, not the president. But the president can alter and amend executive administrative agencies to ensure that the legislation drafted by Congress can be more effectively enforced. So that is one avenue of significant change in the U.S. We also see, remembering from the judicial branch lectures, the significant impact that a landmark ruling can provide that stems from the Supreme Court in the way that federal law or state law is even interpreted. So Supreme Court rulings, both state and federal level, are significant pivots and they reveal significant changes in the enforcement of various policies in the United States. We also see the activities of political parties. Every election year, you have political caucuses and conventions within the states that also happen on a national level, in which people debate the party platforms. They understand what the focus of the entire party at large will be, what the messaging will be at large. And the way that political parties shift their focusing and their messaging can significantly shift and reveal shifts within the political landscape and change in how and the legislation that representatives are aiming to implement. We also see the application or the dismantling of customs. Think of George Washington during his first term, as he made the precedent that any president will only take 2 terms as in office. Although there was no written law, these customs, the application of these traditions or the dismantling of these traditions can bring significant changes in the political landscape. There are some in recent years customs that have been dismantled to reveal the shift in recent politics that certain candidates can bring the national political landscape. And then we see through social movements, through political protests, through civilians going out with acts of civil disobedience, we can see through civil unrest calls for change. Within the United States in recent years, this is evident as we see various movements like the women's movement, the Women's March in DC that happens every few years. We also see the Black Lives Matter protests that happen nationally. We see anti-mask protests that happen during the peak of COVID nationally as well. Significant protests like this can be very beneficial in changing the political landscape. And without acts of civil disobedience, like Martin Luther King walking down the bridge of Selma, we would not have shifts and change within government. So although sometimes this can be problematic and it can be overwhelming and it can come with a lot of emotion, without these expressions of civil unrest, there are a lot of movements that would not have had the progress that they obtained in the decades that they led with civil unrest. So all these indirect avenues to implementing change, either as an individual or encouraging other individuals to implement change within your federal government, these are the ways that society changes. These are the ways that you can engage with your society, your government, your representatives to make actual change. You can be a delegate for your political party. Simply engage with your political party. Engage with your political party. Go to their conventions on the state level, which are very accessible. Any individual can gain the power to go to a state convention for your political party, and then debate the policies, debate the angle in which you want your representatives to tackle these issues. And that word will be distributed. So many ways you can create change. Now, talking about social movements, I want to briefly cover a few, and we've talked about this briefly. Social movements, just generally understood, are purposeful, organized groups striving to work towards a common goal. Simplify it and understand it as that. Purposeful gatherings, organized groups with an aim to implement a common goal united between all of them. Think of Occupy Wall Street, Arab Springs, think about anti-mask protests, Black Lives Matter protests, women's rights protests, civil rights social movements. Without these movements, we could not see a lot of the change that was needed. The Me Too movement. These are all important movements that are purposeful, represented by an organized group and many individuals who identify with that organized group, who are working towards a common goal, which often is implementation or dismantling of certain legislation. Now, we also see a term called grassroots movement. Now, this is simple. Think of grassroots movement as a confederal system. Remember the three systems of government: federal, confederal, and unitary. Confederal power comes from the bottom up. Well, that's how grassroots movement is. It's power stemming from the people, small, unorganized at times, collectives that work from a power bottom up structure to create an organized effort undertaken by numerous groups, pluralism, within a single system, numerous groups of individuals in a single system in a single geographic area that are aiming to bring about specific change. So we see the civil rights movement. A lot of individuals who marched and protested during the civil rights movement were not previously connected to established organizations. Although you had the established organizations front and center, you had numerous individuals who just joined in with their everyday lives to become a part of a movement. You saw this in mass with the Black Lives Matter movement and with the women's rights movement, the Me Too movement as well. You see a lot of grassroots movements focusing on social issues, and you see them as the masses gathering and gradually throughout the movement becoming more organized within a specific area to bring about a specific change. And there's another reality when we talk about social movements. There are two things that are inevitable. And when you study social movements on a larger scale and go and spend a whole semester diving into just a social movement, you'll see that there's no overwhelming problem like the existence of a counter movement to every movement that will ever exist, and the free rider problem. The free rider problem, one must acknowledge, and we've talked about this already, it's when there are individuals who are a part of a collective that do not pay into the movement but benefit from the movement's progress. That you will always, in every single movement ever, have a level of a free rider problem, as there are individuals who cannot or will not engage at a high level, but will still reap the benefits that protest and that social movement provided. Now, in reality, there will be a free rider problem in all social movements, but it can be mitigated, and there's a degree where there can be harm. That is something that is very circumstantial and up for debate based on each movement. And we also see that when you have a movement, you will also have a free rider problem, but you will have a guarantee that there will be a counter movement. If you have a movement against masks, there will be a movement for masks. If you have a Black Lives Matter movement, there will be an All Lives Matter movement. There has never been a social movement or protest that has not invoked a counter movement. It is simply human nature. You can dive into the psychology that drives this, but you will always incentivize a counter movement. And when you act as a citizen, as in a part of a social movement, in a part of a protest, acknowledging the spark of a counter movement that you will undeniably create can help you understand the avenue to represent your interests in the best and most accessible way that understands the possible counter movements that will stem from your positions. So The detriments of social movements: there will always be a free rider problem and there will always be a counter movement. But social movements are the essential avenue to represent general disagreement and dissatisfaction with government. Social movements, grassroots movements, are essential and have resulted in mass amounts of civil unrest at times, mass amounts of progress by legislation. Now, when you look at social media in specific movements, you see that social movements require the use of institutions and tools. Social media has been used during movements recently at high rates to present atrocities to the general public, distribute footage, and most importantly, schedule and coordinate mass protests. So you see these three different impacts and uses of the tool of the institution of social media through these movements. You see Me Too movement utilize social media to present atrocities, to say, hey, look at what's happening to our collective. If we can put it front and center in your face, you can see that these harms are evident. The Black Lives Matter movement used social media to distribute footage of police oversteps that resulted in death, which revealed the emotion that sparked their involvement with the movement, utilizing social media to convey rationality, convey emotion to those who did not have access to it. The March for Our Lives movement protests in reaction to the Parkland shooting in the Southeast. We also see that really peaked in the Southeast, where I was living at the time. They utilized social media to schedule a mass coordinated national march against certain policy positions. All three of these movements, as I mentioned before, had the free rider problem. All three of these movements, as I mentioned before, sparked a counter movement. They utilized the institution of social media to present atrocities, distribute footage, and schedule and coordinate. A tool essential to grassroots movements' success is social media. Institutions around them. Movements must utilize institutions. So we also want to rewind a bit. Remember the impact that our Supreme Court has when it comes to the implementation of change. We see a Supreme Court ruling can create immediate ripple effects in the way laws are being enforced nationwide on the state and national level. Certain rulings like Roe v. Wade can implement trigger laws that consist of legislation written decades prior that are now into effect due to the ruling within a national federal Supreme Court ruling. We saw that in numerous states that had immense impact on individual lives, better or worse. We also see overturning in Dobbs v. Jackson, which made these trigger laws go into effect. Also see numerous state rights expansions under this Supreme Court ruling. We also remember Brown v. Board of Education, the impact that had in dismantling the segregated southern United States that existed in the 1960s, providing my parents an opportunity to have education that was desegregated when previously they would have not been able to. We see the United States versus Nixon intervening in national politics in response to the Watergate scandal. Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Nixon was not above the law and had to comply with a subpoena, which released the tapes that were very infamous and revealed a lot of the backroom dealing that was founding that action. So we see the Supreme Court can even have impacts. We didn't cover this in our lecture, but we see that through this one, it can have impacts on how in the transparency and validity of presidential actions even. Significant reach. We see through Obergefell versus Hodges, the expansion of equal marriage rights provided to all, that we see it in the lecture as guaranteed to same-sex marriage for all individuals, for those in same-sex couples. But we also see that Obergefell versus Hodges, if you look at other collectives, expanded the right for people with disabilities to marry people with disabilities, with or without disabilities. This is a significant pivot that a lot of us overlook, that you don't see the entirety of the impacts of Supreme Court legislation, but they do have those impacts. So expansion of the right to marriage, utilize the Due Process Clause, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which is cited time and time again within our Supreme Court. We also see the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, 2009, 2010-ish, rulings provided in 2010, and where the controversial ruling that created the amount of money that funnels through politics that we have today. Prior to this ruling, we had not even half of the amount of money funneled through a presidential campaign as we have in recent years. And since this ruling, we have seen records being broken nearly every election year, with most money in federal politics. So the impacts of the Supreme Court are expansive, from women's reproductive rights, segregation laws, the actions and validity of the president, or marriage rights, to the money that governs our politics, the way we regulate our finances. The impact of the Supreme Court is immense. And you as an individual can communicate with these individuals. You can reach out to them. You can write them professional letters. You can try and bring these cases to the Supreme Court eventually. You can be the individual that starts in the district courts, makes your way up to the circuit, and then eventually finds the Supreme Court in our three-tiered Supreme Court federal court system. So know that through this institution that has visible change in every ruling it provides, you can engage yourself. You can engage and represent your interests. So this gets me to the main takeaway we're going to have in this lecture. The main point we need to remember from today's lecture is that we can change our Constitution. We can add amendments. Article 5 of the Constitution reads, I will read it for you, quote, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, 2/3 of both houses, House and Senate, quote, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, the second avenue for implementing a constitutional amendment, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, the state legislatures, the majority of 3/4 of the states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Equal suffrage, remember, 2 representatives in the Senate for every state, even provides a further protection for that system of representation. We also see that they mention the first and fourth clauses of the 9th section of the first article. The 9th Amendment, that you cannot have implementations of an amendment that overrides the rights previously provided in the Bill of Rights. So we see that when we look at Article 5 of our Constitution, it provides the groundwork for implementing change through constitutional amendments in 2 specific and very different avenues: congressional proposal and constitutional convention. Now, constitutional convention is immensely rare. We have all recent constitutional amendments implemented through congressional proposal, and that is the avenue we will focus on. But it is very important to remember that there are 2 ways to implement constitutional change: through congressional approval and through a constitutional convention, which we have not had in many decades. And let's keep going on and look into more detail on how to make change within our Constitution. All right, sorry about that technical difficulty. Things happened. I panicked. Everything worked out though. So here's a graphic for how the 2 avenues for implementing constitutional change. You need proposal by Congress and a convention. So let's look at proposal by Congress right here on this side, as you can see right here. So proposed by Congress, approval. You need 2/3 majority in the House, then it will go to the Senate, where you need another 2/3 majority in the Senate, and then you need a 3/4 vote of all state legislatures required. This is the ratification process. When you implement a constitutional amendment, it comes in 2 parts: proposal and ratification. So we see that this part right here is the ratification process, where you need the state legislatures, that is the 100 people that make up the Montana House of Representatives, and additionally all of these senators that make up the Montana State Senate. These individuals will have to vote and have a 3/4. They will need a majority in their states. We need 3/4 of all states to ratify a constitutional amendment for it to be implemented on the federal level. And that is how, right here, every constitutional amendment since the 10th has been implemented. Now we see over here, this is constitutional convention. This is where you see it is petitioned by 2/3 of the states, where you have Congress calls a convention to propose the amendment, in which they all meet in one specific location at one specific time, and you need, in this avenue, 3/4 of the votes of all state legislatures to ratify a constitutional amendment that was debated at the convention. We are focusing in today's lecture on this avenue, although it is important to remember that this avenue exists. And when I ask you how many ways are there to implementing a constitutional amendment on to the U.S. Constitution, there are 2 ways with 2 steps in both of these avenues, 2 and 2. Proposal, ratification, and that is congressional proposal and constitutional convention. So very important to remember 2 avenues to proposing a constitutional amendment: convention, proposal, 2 steps, proposal, ratification. Oh. And let me turn the red dot thing off. I don't know how to go to the next slide. Somebody help. Hello. I'm struggling to change the slide for some reason. All right, y'all. I hope this is working out well. I had some technical difficulties on that last slide, so I just had to move some things around and restart. So if there's any sentences that get cut off, email me and I'll be sure to check that. But let's talk about some specific constitutional amendments. And there are 2 in particular that reveal a dimension of how we work with our Constitution to either abolish previous amendments that we believe did not benefit the population, and how we represent our specific interests. So first, I want to talk about the 18th Amendment. There was a specific point in U.S. history in which alcohol consumption was becoming quite problematic. There were numerous movements in which you had individuals, you had families advocating for the abolition of alcohol consumption because, well, it was connected to abusive households, it was connected to drunk driving and deaths, and we saw significant problems regarding alcohol consumption. So we, as a nation, implemented the 18th Amendment, known as the Prohibition Amendment. This prohibited the right to drink alcoholic beverages anywhere in the United States. Now, there was still a lot of alcohol consumption within the United States done through backroom dealing. We see the term speakeasies coming up at this time period as they were hidden, secretive bars. We see the copying of that sentiment in numerous public bars today. But we also know throughout our history that because of the 18th Amendment and the fact that we today, as adults, can legally drink alcohol, that we know that we can actually reverse constitutional amendments. But there's one way to do it, and that is through another constitutional amendment. So how do we change or abolish a constitutional amendment? We implement another one. Well, the 21st Amendment abolished the 18th Amendment. Only amendment repealing a past amendment. This is the only time we have done this in the United States. The 21st Amendment comes with 3 sections. They read, the first section is, the 18th article of amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. The second, the transportation or importation into any state, territory, or possession of the United States for delivery or use therein of intoxicating liquors in violation of the laws, therefore, is hereby prohibited. The second section, this article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by convention in the several states as provided in the Constitution within 7 years from the date of the submission hereof to the states by the Congress. And they did see the ratification on the state level of this amendment. And we officially overruled and repealed the 18th Amendment by ratifying the 21st Amendment. So can you change an amendment to the U.S. Constitution? Yes, you can abolish a previous one. How? The only way to do it is through another constitutional amendment. Okay, it's being weird. It won't change slides for me. So it looks like I'm going to have to do that thing where I cancel and start again. So again, let me know if you're having technical difficulties. This is being really weird on my end for some reason, but we got this. All right, here we go. I had to cancel it and then restart it to get this, to let it record this slide for me. So I hope it's working. So the 27th Amendment. Let's look at another case study of an amendment that reveals an interesting dimension of change in the U.S. So the 27th Amendment is the most recent amendment that has been implemented in the United States Constitution. This amendment was originally proposed by James Madison as a part of the original Bill of Rights, Remember from that first lecture, when James Madison first drafted the Bill of Rights, he presented 17 amendments, 7 of which were abolished or adapted or merged into previous amendments to result in the final 10 Amendment Bill of Rights. The 27th Amendment very simply writes that it restricts Congress's ability to raise their pay, and if they do raise their pay, it does not get implemented until the next electoral season. So if you, as a congressman, vote to raise your pay raise will not go into effect until the next election has occurred. So the people have the power to vote you out if you were raising your pay selfishly for greedy purposes. That was the general intention of this amendment. It was taken out in the first round of debates regarding the Bill of Rights, but it was ratified as the most recent one in 1992, before most of our lives. So we haven't had a constitutional amendment for most of us in our entire lives. So 27th Amendment ratified in 1992, originally written in the first proposal of the Bill of Rights, but it lay dormant silently in the history books for decades, for generations, until a college paper at Texas University had to, just a simple introduction to American government course, had to write a paper a lot like what you're writing, actually had the prompt that some of you have selected, which was to write a constitutional amendment that you believe should and could be ratified. Well, this student wrote this paper. They got really into it. They found this amendment through some archives regarding the first Bill of Rights and said, I'm going to write about this amendment. This amendment can come back. We need this. Improve transparency of representatives. The student wrote the paper, turned it into the class, and the professor, this proves that my opinion doesn't matter as much because the professor didn't even like the paper. The professor gave the student a C, moved him on, and then the student was like, you know what? This is better than the professor sees. I can make change. This is something that student believed in. So what did they do? They mailed it to every single elected representative within Congress. And it caught the attention of a congressman from Maine. This is a student from Texas writing this and mailing this letter to a representative in Maine. Very different states, thousands of miles apart. And this congressman brought this amendment forward and eventually got this amendment ratified. This stemming, of course, originally from James Madison, but would not have been a recent constitutional amendment if it weren't for a motivated and dedicated student who wrote a paper that a professor didn't even like. So no matter what grade you get on your term paper, maybe try and change the world with it. And if you can follow the steps of this Texas University student, you'll change the world. Oh, cool, it's working. I got to just click to this slide. So I also wanted to talk about some times where change doesn't happen and your efforts don't work out perfectly. But that is not the end, and the discussions will always persist, and change can eventually come. So I want to point out that in 1968, there was a proposed constitutional amendment. There was a public opinion survey by Gallup, one of the most respectable public opinion surveys, and I'm not talking about polls regarding who's becoming the president. I'm talking about polls on public opinion on issues that are not as politicized, very accurate readings of the general population sentiments. So Gallup polls revealed in 1968 that 80% of the population, federal population, was in favor of abolishing the Electoral College. Well, some representatives saw this and brought forward a constitutional amendment proposal to abolish the Electoral College. 80% of the population was in support. It was an exciting time. And the House of Representatives voted to implement the new amendment, 338 votes to 70, passing through the House. But when it was brought to the Senate, remember that tool that exists only in the Senate, only to senators, that have been utilized to delay debate and delay the vote on a certain piece of legislation? Well, this is, and if you look at its successful uses through history, there are 6 predominant ones. There are a couple other small achievements, but the filibuster has successfully halted 6 significant pieces of legislation. Majority of those regarding civil rights. All of them, to a degree, representing policy positions in support from the general public. Well, one of those is the amendment abolishing the Electoral College. There was a filibuster in the Senate. The Senate resulted in it being 5 votes short of cloture that would end the filibuster, and it was never debated on, never voted on within the Senate, and we had the abolition of this constitutional amendment, and we had it die out within Congress. And what does it result in? We still have an electoral system, which is winner takes all. And what does winner take all mean? It means that whoever wins, we don't care how they win, just if you win, all of the votes, the electoral college votes relating to the electoral college, all of the electoral college votes will go to the winner of the election that oftentimes does not even have over 50% of the popular vote. And we have this system in place, winner takes all, instead of a majority vote within the vote of the presidency, because in large part for many reasons, but one of those many reasons, if you take a snapshot of history, is because of a successful filibuster in 1968. And a lot of the critiques of winner takes all is it overvalues certain swing states. As you see in our most recent presidential election, there was about 7 states that decided the election instead of it being the entirety of the 50 with the electoral swings impact, and many states were quite predictable. You probably laughed like I did when you were sitting there on election night and the polls close in Montana and California, and only 5 seconds later do they announce the winner of Montana and California prior to counting a single vote, because these electoral states are very predictable. With winner takes all systems, they will not create the significant shifts in political landscapes that could exist if it was within those states. Most importantly, if there was a simple majority vote that would be implemented if we abolished the Electoral College in 1968. So here's your what did we learn? These are the takeaways from the lecture. A lot of this is review, but you got to remember how many ways to implement constitutional change. What are the steps? Proposal, ratification, pretty simple. How many avenues? There's congressional proposal and constitutional convention. What occurred in 1968? We had a filibuster that really restricted the constitutional amendment that abolished the Electoral College and delayed that progress. Remember the 18th, 21st, 27th, 18th prohibition, 21st abolishes prohibition, 27th restricted the way a congressman can increase their pay, and that it stemmed from a college paper that you are writing yourself. So how do you make change? Put a little bit more attention to your college paper. Make sure you have a great paper that you turn in for your final essay. And after you turn it in, after you get my comments, maybe critique it a little bit and then send it to your representatives. Make that change. Utilize the avenues we talked about today to change the society around you, to at least give the people who represent your lives, your elected representatives, the opportunity to understand your sentiments. What did we learn? Look at here. If it confuses you, email me. I'll explain anything and everything. Here's some answers. And what is due this week? Make sure you get this stuff in. What is due? We're finally wrapping up. We're really, really close to the end. Next week we have a lecture without any assignments, just on, well, we will have to finish up our last discussion post next week when we cover foreign policy. This week you have to contribute your traditional discussion post, 3 posts that you start every time we start a new discussion thread. So make sure you get those in. View the lecture, do the readings, prepare for the final. There are no assignments or quizzes this week. All you have to do from here on out is listen to these lectures, finish up your paper, and prepare for your final. I pushed the final and essay due dates back a little bit to give you a little more breathing room from what they originally were posted on the syllabus. And so the final exam will be between the 29th and the 1st. And if you cannot meet that window, communicate to me prior to the 29th, and I will work with you happily. Also, our final papers will be due December 1st. I really recommend you separating those 2 time periods and focusing on one and then the other, while of course getting the foundations down prior to be able to easily wrap up your paper on the 1st. Now, reach out to me if you have any confusion with deadlines, if you are concerned about the content, you don't know how to study, whatever it is, reach out to me. A Zoom call, we can get to a positive position, and really I think you'll do great. But if you don't reach out to me, I don't know your concerns, I don't know your issues, so I don't know how to help you. So I need you to communicate with me, and don't communicate with intensity, because I'm trying to help you. I want to help you. I want to be here for you. You just gotta reach out and tell me what I can do for you, and it will be done. So reach out, let's communicate, let's meet over Zoom, let's have email conversations. You can text me. Some people have done that, and it's perfectly fine. You can text me if you really need immediate attention with something. So reach out, communicate, check your grades. Everything should be graded for the most part, except for that last quiz for a small few of you and that last discussion thread because, well, I can't grade it because you haven't finished it. So please make sure you get all that done. On the final exam, there will be one question that I ask you that I want you to take seriously and start thinking about before you take your final. Of course, don't stress about it, but I want to be able to provide the best education for the future students I have in this class, especially those online. And online education is something I'm still navigating, I'm still learning about myself. So when we take our final, everyone will get credit on this question even if you leave it blank, but there will be a final question at the end that's written response, and I ask you, what can I do as a professor to make this content more fun, more comprehensible, and make the class easier but still engaging and something that helps you develop? What can I do to improve this learning experience? I want you to be honest. I want you to critique me. I want you to help the next student who comes through this class. Help me make this more fun for the future. I can only yell so many times in these lectures, and I know some of you might not even be listening to these to the point to have the enjoyment that I hope I can convey in the way I talk about these issues at times. But really, help me, work with me to improve education for people in the future so I can understand how I could have helped you better and can help others in the future that learn like you. I will take everything seriously, and even if you give me the most intense critique, you tell me I'm just mean, I don't care about you, whatever. If that's your position, tell it to me in that essay, and I'll give you 100% on that question, grade it honestly, respectfully, and thank you for saying it, and I'll work on it in the future. So please convey how I can improve to help you and your friends that come through this class in the future. So thank you guys. One more lecture with new content next week, and it's foreign policy, mutually assured destruction. Really cool stuff, and I'm excited to talk about it with you guys. So talk to you guys soon. I'll talk to a lot of you through email, and yeah, reach out. Please reach out. I'd love to talk.